Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to Practice Makes Faithful. Today we are on Season 1, Episode 18. As always, I'm Ben Patterson. I'm joined here by Paul Hugobart, and we are excited to dive into today's conversation.
Yeah, I'm glad that you are always Ben Patterson.
I know.
If you showed up and you were not Ben Patterson one day, I wouldn't be sure what to do with that.
I was going to go the other way around, say as always I'm joined by Paul, but I ended up switching it. And
That's great. I love it. Good to be here.
Today we are, as of when we are shooting this, it's the day after Mother's Day. Mm-hmm. How was your Mother's Day yesterday, Paul?
It was good. I mean, it was really good. I can't remember the last time I spent Mother's Day with my mom. And so my parents were here with us on Mother's Day, which was really neat. They traveled up from where they live in Panama City, Florida, and then we're traveling on to my sister's. So that was really neat, and got to also then spend Mother's Day with the mother of my children, which is really awesome. Mm-hmm. So my wife and got to be with her, and we had a fun kind of, we got Cracker Barrel at Cracker Barrel, brought it back to the house, because if you go to Cracker Barrel, it was wild. I mean, I showed up and the lady says to me, they're greeting people outside, because there's so many people at Cracker Barrel on Mother's Day, of course, and she says to me, before I could even step up, she says, the wait is 2 hours. Are you okay with that? And I said, well, I'm actually here to pick something up because we ordered ahead. So yeah, it was good. That was good.
Wise thinking there.
Yeah, so we had Cracker Barrel for Mother's Day, which is one of Lori's favorites. And so, and then after that, just kind of relaxed and had a nice awesome time at home. So
awesome. Yeah, and we had a great day here at Grace Chapel yesterday. It was a whole lot of fun, just getting to celebrate the mothers and giving out some flowers, and just always make it a nice, fun day.
Yeah, for sure.
And you had a message yesterday that connected a little bit with Mother's Day in our series, Under Pressure. So why don't you actually, let's just start with, tell us a little bit about Under Pressure, the series on 1 Thessalonians, for anyone who may have missed last week or doesn't know where we're at with this. So let's just give us a little bit of a recap on what is this series about, why 1 Thessalonians?
Yeah, so again, this first letter that Paul wrote to the church in Thessalonica is probably his first letter that he wrote, period. It was written to a group of Christians who we see again that church was established in Acts 17. We see that the church was established under pressure. Mm-hmm. Paul knew right away that there were attacks coming. In fact, he talks about that at the beginning of this text from chapter 2, where we were in as we were here together yesterday. And he talks about the fact that right from the get-go, he was under pressure in Philippi, then he came to Thessalonica, could tell in Thessalonica they were going to be under some of the same kind of pressure, but then knew leaving, if he'd faced that kind of pressure as he was sharing the gospel message, then the new Christians at this church in Thessalonica were going to share that same kind of pressure, and so he's concerned for them. And so really the whole letter written to this little group of Christians in Thessalonica was about dealing with the pressure and what kind of attitude to have as they were under pressure from culture around them to compromise the new life they'd been called into, living faithfully for Jesus. Whether that was, whether they had been previously engaged at the synagogue because they were Jewish converts, or whether they had been engaged at a pagan temple and in pagan worship, or in really worship of Caesar, because that was what Rome really specialized in, making sure that Caesar was seen as a god. In fact, if you look back historically, so many sources point to the fact that the Caesars often like to view themselves as gods. We're God in the flesh in some sort of way. And so there was real pressure upon the Christians in Thessalonica, no matter what their background was, to not now live this new life that was centered on faith in Christ. So I think why this letter now, I think because there's so much that, as I've said in this series to this point, is there's so much that we can learn from the Thessalonian Christians as it relates to living life under pressure and what that looks like for us. How do we live faithfully as we start to find ourselves more and more under pressure from the culture around us? Mm-hmm. So I think, lot for us to learn here. We are a church under pressure at this point in time. We are a people under pressure. We talked about this, I think, in the first series we did in this podcast at the beginning of the year. And it was using the John Mark Comer quote saying, that it used to be Christianity held a place of honor in this nation, where now, because of the kind of the cultural vibe and vogue, Christianity and Christians now actually hold sometimes a place of shame within culture. And so for us to think that we're not under pressure, we're a little naive if we think that's true and maybe kind of fooling ourselves. So we're under pressure now, and I believe we're going to continually, at least for the next several years, for the foreseeable future, with the way culture is shifting, find ourselves under more pressure. And it's not going to be, I don't think it's going to take the form of outright persecution, but it's going to take the form of pressure to do and be things differently, or at least to do what we're doing quietly.
Yeah,
and
gotcha.
not be the kind of people that God asks us to be, a light on a hill, which is anything but quiet. In fact, remember Jesus says, nobody takes a light and then puts a basket over top of it. We don't do that. But that is what culture around us is asking us to do, to take the light that we've been given, the light of Jesus Christ himself that now lives within us, and put a bushel over top of it. And so I think that's the pressure that we'll be facing in this culture right now, to cover that light.
That's good. So Thessalonians, because this book is a good example of a church that did live under pressure.
Absolutely.
So tell us a little bit about where'd you go with it this week? You kind of connected things into Mother's Day a little bit.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about where we went in the message this week.
Yeah, so in chapter 2, a good chunk of that text, Paul uses this very family-oriented language to talk about the way that he engaged with the Christians in Thessalonica when he spent about that month that he was there with Silas, planting that church, establishing the church by preaching the gospel both in the synagogue and then preaching the gospel out in the public square and public places as well. Not Publix, the grocery store. I think for some reason my mind went there just now. The Publix places. Now the public places, although if you want to go preach in Publix, that probably is pretty cool. Yeah, back on track. We digress. So, as he's engaging and talking with the Thessalonican Christians, again, what he's saying to them is, here's the way I lived, here's the way we lived when we are among you. In using this family-oriented language, he also then commends them after that section for living under pressure by seeing the example of the church in Jerusalem. And then I think by proxy also the example of the way that Paul and Silas lived when they were with them. That's now how they were living and treating each other under pressure. So we looked at this section of text really yesterday and talking about it today on the podcast in a way to say, look, here's an example for how we ought to live as a church under pressure. Now back to the Mother's Day connection. Paul actually in this section of text talks about the way that he lived. He begins talking about, the first thing that he points to is this, that he lived among them like young children first. I think to first point out the level of humility that he embraced among them. Didn't come in with pride and boasting, and he says later, we didn't use flattery, or I think he says that actually earlier, we didn't use flattery among you. We just let the gospel be the gospel. And instead of coming in and trying to act like we were big shots, and we were really important folks, and you should listen to us because we're wise and we know, he says, no, first what we did was we lived like young children among you. Really to show that level of humility, that that positional, I guess, if you think about the way that people can use position in life to try to influence others, you can lord it over some. Jesus says, in fact, that's not the way we do it in the kingdom of God. We don't lord it over others like the Gentiles do. Paul says we actually intentionally took a position of subservience, in a sense, to show you the gospel, as we showed the gospel to you. Then he goes from there to say, and just as a nursing mother cares for her children, so we cared for you. And then probably one of my, I'd say, if I had a list of maybe 20 favorite verses, this would probably be on it, this next verse. I love what Paul says here when he describes his love for the Thessalonian Christians. He says, we loved you so much that we didn't just share with you the gospel. Remember, that's what he's been talking about. We did share with you the gospel. Of course we did. When we did it from this kind of position of subservience. We cared for you like a nursing mother cares for her children. Then he goes on to say this: we shared the gospel, yes, but so much more than that, we also shared with you our lives. We gave of ourselves to you. And he reinforces this later in the text by saying, basically talking about how he gave of his life. He was willing to suffer for them. He didn't want them to suffer in any way, didn't want to be a burden on them. And so all these things, we talked about this in the sense of Mother's Day. I mean, this is what the best mothers do for their children. They love them in a way that shares their life with them. They don't withhold their life from them. I think about, stories that I've heard of moms who are sometimes aloof from their children. And sometimes, not to pick upon pop culture idols or Hollywood people, but that's sometimes where you hear the stories, of this mom who's so busy that she didn't have any time for her kids, and sometimes we hear that about dads who are so involved in their work and their business or whatever it happens to be, their executive role, whatever, that they are removed from their children and kind of aloof from their children. And that is exactly the opposite of what Paul says they did. Paul says, yeah, we worked when we were among you. In fact, we worked our fingers to the bone. We worked like crazy. He says we worked both day and night so that we didn't have to be a burden to you. I think about in the last several generations, and this is not, there are a number of reasons why this is true, I think, sociologically, but one of them is that we don't have a hope for our children that they're going to have it better than we did. There are a number of studies that point to that these days, where in previous generations, the belief was, my children can and will have it better than what I did. And we actually there's this collective feeling that we kind of reached the best of what could be, and now we're sort of heading downward from here. And so the general sense of optimism about what's coming has gone away and been replaced with a sense of pessimism. But in those days when optimism reigned, you go back to the greatest generation and even some of the boomer generation, there was this attitude that believed, if I work hard and sacrifice for my children, they will have a better life than my life. And a lot of people still choose to live that way, regardless of kind of feelings about what may be coming or what's already gone. But Paul is saying, this is the way we lived our lives for you. I mean, we worked day and night so you could have things better than we have them. Day and night we worked. We didn't want to be a burden on you whatsoever. We shared our lives with you because we knew we had something so good to offer you that we couldn't withhold it. So all the time we're giving. I mean, that's what Paul says. We poured into you that way. And so, again, let me read that verse one more time just because it's so powerful. He says, because we loved you so much, we are delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well. I mean, a deep measure of love. Again, that very family-centered, family-oriented language. And then Paul concludes, he does it, with talking about fathers as well. He says, we encouraged you like the best fathers do. We admonished you, we comforted you, we were calling you to something. And so kind of, what I said out of that is that, as the best of fathers do, Paul and Silas, they encouraged and called the Thessalonians to what he knew was best for them. And so, we did have a little bit of I would say this wasn't a Mother's Day message, but there was that real family component to everything we talked about yesterday. And so that was a big part of the message. And so certainly calling out and celebrating moms for the things that moms do so well as they give sacrificially. And I think about the way my mom did that in our family. I think about the way I know my grandmother did that. Both of my grandmothers did that for the sake of their children. The way that Lori, my wife, now does for our children. And frankly, it's different than what I do. We play somehow different roles in the way we love and pour into our children. But Paul says, and we don't need to miss this, it doesn't have to be gender specific. In fact, Paul is calling out what is so good about the way women are often just naturally wired, and then saying we in the church, all of us should imitate that kind of behavior and care for each other that way, especially leaders within the church should care for the flock like a nursing mother cares for her children, to share not just the gospel, but their lives as well. So I think, really, really powerful section of text that way.
Yeah, that's really good. So tell me, why do you think that's so important? Like this language, Paul's using a lot of familial language about children, fathers, mothers. Why is that so important to this conversation? Why is that something that you focused on as we're talking about faith under pressure, living faithfully under pressure?
Yeah. Well, I think there is a recognition when times are difficult, there's an extra level of care required, especially for the flock, for the people of God, right? And Paul recognized that. But I want you to think too about, Paul was with this church, these young Christians, for about a month, and then was run out of town. Now, he continues to try to care for them. Obviously, this letter that he's writing, and he writes another letter not too far after he writes this one, and sends Timothy to check up on them so that he can continue to care for them kind of from a distance. But for a people under pressure, when times are tough, the level of care that those people require to live faithfully, I think, increases. When times are easy and when things are going well, sometimes, and this is not always a good thing, frankly, but we can kind of just, coast, and we can kind of, it's almost like we live life in cruise control, and things can go pretty well when things around us are going well, even when we're in cruise control. Now, the reality is we could do a whole lot better than living life in cruise control when things are going well. But when times get tough, we need something more than cruise control can provide for us in that sense.
Yeah.
And especially from our leaders, and especially for those of us who are leaders, we have to be able to engage with people in a way that loves them well, that cares for them well, that shepherds their souls through difficult times, through trying times. You think about it, and I don't remember where this came from now, but you've got this thing, these are the times that try men's souls. Well, the times that try our souls are when things are difficult around us, when culture around us is putting pressure upon us to live differently, to think differently, to look at the Word of God differently, as though it's not the authority for our lives in the way we live, but it's just some helpful suggestions, and a lot of it was just centered on the culture then, and so we don't really need to worry about much of it now. Even some commands, saying some specific commands, well, that doesn't really apply to us anymore. We don't need to worry about that. And so even from within the church at times, there can be this pressure to not live faithfully into what God has called us to live faithfully into, right? To not live faithfully the life that He's called us to do. And it begins by asking, I think very simple questions. I can think about this especially, in my teenage years, my early 20s, thinking about the way that I lived in relation to God and wondering how much do I have to do to get by in my faith relationship with God. We ask that question and we start to compromise the way we live all over the place, and we start to compromise our faithfulness as well, instead of asking, how much can I do for the God who's already done so much for me? So how deep can I go in faithfulness? We ask the question of how little do I have to do to be faithful? Well, certainly when there's pressure on us from, I think, sometimes without and sometimes within, it becomes more and more tempting to ask the question, how little do I need to do to actually be faithful, instead of how much can I do to express faithfulness to God? So we start to compromise in different places because there's pressure on us. We know this is true with the concept of peer pressure. And we tend to think about that in relation to middle schoolers and high schoolers and sometimes college students, and then we think that we don't have peer pressure once we're past the college world. And the reality is we absolutely do. Oh, yeah. There's peer pressure on all of us at every stage of life from culture around us. And so we need that extra level of care and support, which then becomes peer pressure, maybe in a sense, in a positive way. We talk about that in the sense of positive peer pressure, but maybe not in the sense of pressure. We should talk about it in the sense of positive soul care for those who are under pressure from the world around. I talked yesterday a little bit about these two concepts, the way that two theories about the way that people react when they're under pressure, or when there's a stressor that they're feeling. Okay, so most people are familiar with fight or flight. It just if not, Ben, if you walked into my office and you were really angry at me about something, I could either get angry back at you and we could duke it out, or whatever that devolved into, or I could run away because
we're not recounting a real event.
No. Yes, it's important that everybody realizes this has never happened.
No, not yet.
Ben and I have intense conversations from time to time, but they're always pretty positive. So that's good. We think about this in the sense of road rage, for example. When road rage escalates, it's because two people who are in a fight or flight situation decided to fight instead of hit the brakes, turn away, turn off, accelerate and get away, whatever it happens to be, to defuse the situation. They decided to fight and allow the situation to escalate. Right, so that's what we're talking about, fight or flight. You're outside at night and you hear a scary noise. Do you turn around and look to see what that noise is in almost a confrontational manner, or do you do like I do and drop the trash cans and run inside the house? No, I don't tend to do that. I just walk faster and get back inside of the house more quickly. But we don't know what's out in the dark, and so depending on your personality wiring, you may be more wired to the fight response, or you may be more wired to the flight response. Now, in all honesty, this is the response that tends to be more centered on the generalized male persona as well, too. And in fight or flight, we talked about first and was described first and theorized first because much of social psychology used to actually center on the actions of men, and we weren't too worried about others. Now, fortunately, we've opened our eyes since then and realized that 50% of the population out here is women, and so we don't need to be worrying about just what men think. We need to worry about what women think as well. And so we also talked during the message about this other way of responding during a tense situation, this other theory that's now become known as tend and befriend.
Yeah, this one was new to me. I had not heard this before.
Yeah, so I hadn't heard of it until recently either, actually in the conversation around what's happening in the Ukraine crisis right now. And it was actually a newscast talking about the way that many men are going out and fighting, and some women are as well, because again, these are generalizations, right? But generalizations are generally true. I think it's healthy to speak in generalizations. They help us understand the world around us. What can become unhealthy is when we allow those generalizations to become stereotypes.
Yeah, it doesn't need to be a rigid category, but
exactly right. And stereotypes are normally, they exist as a generalization that we're now using in a way to maybe speak negatively into some experience. So we're using these to speak positively for the most part. So we use them as generalizations. So then, as far as the women were concerned, they were showing these underground shelters in Kiev and in Ukraine, where all these women were coming together and sharing their resources and taking care of each other's children. And so they were showing that they were tending each other and they were befriending each other. And they were, here are these little villages developing in these underground either subway systems or basements, and they were seeing this everywhere in this capital city of Ukraine. And so yesterday really leaned into this conversation. I think we should right now as well, too, as it relates to the church. There is, when the church is under pressure, the mode that we need to slip into is the tend and befriend mode. and not the fight or flight mode, which by the way, just think about the situations that we faced over the last several years where the church has actually found herself under pressure quite often. Whether it be, at the beginning of COVID, what do we do? And you had opinions on both sides about what we should do. And there was some fight or flight stuff that happened. We even had people, who did some fighting and then did some flighting afterwards. They didn't like the decisions we made and they left. So there was fight then flight, as it relates to that. And as a leadership, I'm fairly thankful for the way our leaders led during that time, where they did, I think, for the most part, take the tend and befriend approach, even when people were engaging with fight or flight toward us in a sense. But what we need when the church is under pressure, whether it be questions about how should we respond, how did we respond to COVID stuff, masking, no masking, how do we respond to the struggles going on in this country that center around sometimes race, sometimes social status, sometimes, whether people are wealthy or poor, so on the poverty index, and how do we engage there? How do we even engage as we have questions about doctrine or tradition? When the church is under pressure from within and from without, we as a people are called to follow the example of the Apostle Paul and lean into the tend and befriend thing. I can think about go ahead.
I just think it's interesting as you're mentioning that, just thinking about that fight or flight response that we often do, I think, see from the church when it comes to those controversial issues that either a church will often go into the fight mode, it becomes a culture war, right? That it's like we're gonna get into this culture war. We either and whether you're on the pro-mask side or the anti-mask side, either way, we're fighting. Like, this is the way everyone has to do it. We're gonna fight this. Or there's the flight where it becomes, maybe you just say, almost just completely ignoring, like, we're not even gonna say anything about those because it could offend someone, it could bother someone, and you do so often see that response on one of those two extremes that are both not really helpful. So I like this other way that you're explaining.
Yeah, and tend and befriend really comes back to what we talked about last week. It is how do we embrace grace and truth, again, in equal measure as we deal with difficult situations. So how do we embrace grace and truth as we deal with the culture in an appropriate way, instead of just fighting the culture and telling the culture, well, you're all going to hell and sorry, or not sorry, depending upon where you stand. It also affects how we deal with issues inside of the church as we embrace grace and truth in full measure and tend and befriend people who are in the midst of a struggle. And it also means that when we see someone, and I think this is important because this is where we have really let the ball drop at times. When we see someone who is struggling with a sin issue, what is our immediate impulse? Is it to go and push them further away, or is our first impulse to try to see if we can draw them in to actually help them see that there's a better way of living? Because that seems to have been Jesus's response in the midst of crisis. So let's say there's, and we talked about this last week a bit, let's say there is a large and fairly exerted pressure upon the church to think differently, live differently, act differently concerning LGBTQ plus issues. And certainly probably the act differently, there's some good validity in that. We do need to act differently. In fact, that's what I'm going to maybe call us to right now. But if we embraced people with equal measures of grace and truth, or full measure of grace and truth, we would come and we would try to love someone. And if they push us away, they push us away. But we love so that we can speak truth into the life of someone who is living in a way that is outside of the will for, God's will for their life. No matter what that issue happens to be. If you've got someone who's an alcoholic, how are we going to love that person well? And if they push us away, they push us away. But we make the attempt to love so that we can speak truth into the life of one who is hurting. And that comes back to, if I can circle back around on something else, is this idea of what does it mean to be lost? What does it mean to be lost? Well, is lost someone that we just say, well, that's just someone that's going to hell and that's all we think about? Or is it Or when we think of someone as lost, do we see someone who doesn't know the way and doesn't know how they ought to be living life, and is probably struggling and is confused, and even if they don't know they're confused, is probably still confused? And if we do know the way, well, then wouldn't we graciously want to come alongside that person and try to help guide them in the way? And if they push us away, then that's what happens. But we have got to make the attempt in grace and truth together. We have got to make the attempt to tend and befriend people the way Jesus did. We think about the woman at the well. Tend and befriend. We can think about the tax collectors who were pushed away and kept at arm's length. Jesus, tend and befriend. We can think about in the moment that Jesus is hanging on the cross and he says, instead of forget all you, he says, Father, forgive them. So he doesn't say forget them, he says forgive them. Even in that moment, Jesus was at a place of tend and befriend, and that's exactly the way Paul was engaging with his church in Thessalonica.
Could you give us a current example of what that might look like to tend and befriend in an area where we are under pressure? You mentioned the LGBTQ plus
so why don't we
area.
use that one, just because I have a good example there, and it is one where I think we truly find ourselves under pressure. A friend of mine, a guy named Guy Hammond, and you know who he is as well. He works with us in the Renew Network, and so I actually was with Guy last weekend at a Renew event. Guy, and he, I'll tell a little bit of his story. You can find out a lot more of his story. We'll link his website here. I'm having a hard time recalling it right now off the top of my head. Maybe you can find that for us, Ben. Guy Hammond is a man who lived an openly homosexual lifestyle for probably, a solid 10 years of his life.
Strength and Weakness.
Yeah, Strength and Weakness. Yeah, strengthandweakness.org. Awesome ministry that Guy is leading out of Toronto, Canada. Helping people who are part of the LGBTQ community feel the love of Christ and also see how they can live faithfully in an expression to the faithfulness, or in returning the faithfulness that Jesus has already shown to them. So Guy lived an openly homosexual lifestyle. It was through the love of a church that, by the way, loved on him for 2 years before he changed his mind about what God was asking of him. Now, I think there are a lot of churches that if somebody walked in who was living an openly gay lifestyle, if somebody walked in and was open about that lifestyle, would give that person 2 weeks or maybe 2 months.
Yeah.
But can you think about the church who gave someone 2 years? And the difference that made not only in Guy's life, but goodness gracious, Guy is engaging through his ministry and through others who work with his ministry now, I think with more than 1,000 people at a time who are part of the LGBT community or who have been part of the LGBTQ plus community and are coming out of that lifestyle to live faithfully into the way of Jesus, to follow the way of Jesus faithfully, whatever that means.
Yeah.
And has led countless thousands and others to see what that means for them as well. That's incredible. Now imagine if a church had done the tend and befriend thing for a couple of weeks and then went to fight or flight. Look, if you're not going to change after 2 weeks, you can't be here with us.
Yeah.
They leaned into for 2 years embracing Guy as someone who was worthy of being loved. And after 2 years, he changed his mind. And now, 20 plus, 30 plus years later, probably, he's making more of a difference for the sake of Christ, engaging the LGBTQ community. He's making more of a difference in that area than anyone I know.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good example right now. Man,
I would just echo the plugging his stuff as well. Highly recommend. Check out his books, his resources. I think personally, he gives a really great example just in his own life of what it looks like to live faithfully under pressure. As a guy who he still would say he is same-sex attracted, but he is choosing to live in this way that's faithful to Christ.
That's right.
It's brilliant. It's really great stuff.
Agreed. Yeah, we'll tag a few of his resources in the show notes today for sure.
Yeah. That's really helpful. So I really like that tend and befriend approach as the church. I think That's brilliant. Another thing, you made this statement in the message yesterday, and you said that as we find ourselves under pressure, we will still need to remember. I'm sorry, let me restart that again. As we find ourselves under pressure, we will need to remember again why the church is called to live as the family of God. So why does the church under pressure need to live as the family of God? How does this connect into what we've been talking about?
You know, if I can talk about this openly without being too critical, I think it's good for us within the church to be critical at times of ourselves, right? The reality of things. You know, go back before COVID. You know, we had this environment both here and in lots of other churches where we had wonderful experiences on Sunday morning, and that's great. You know, we want to create worshipful experiences on Sunday morning. We want to preach challenging messages on Sunday morning. But if what we're doing on Sundays, and if what we do through the structure and the organization of the church, anytime we have the opportunity to lead in that capacity, doesn't call people into family of God expressions, then we have to be honest and say that maybe we're failing. If it doesn't call us into relationship with each other where we become like brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers. I mean, you know, elsewhere the Apostle Paul talks about older men being fathers, like fathers to younger men, older women being like mothers to younger women, and all of us being brothers and sisters in Christ. We're part of the family of God. And so especially when we're under pressure, if we're not living that way, I'm not sure how much encouragement, I'm not sure how well we are fortifying each other's faith if we're not. You know, so again, we can create a wonderful experience on Sunday morning, but that's 1 hour of the week. And even if we have a few other things going on that could be wonderful and encouraging, maybe we get another hour of the week or 2 hours of the week. And then folks walk out of this wonderful facility or other churches in equally wonderful facilities and face the rest of their life feeling the pressure of the culture around them. You know, so Barna's research, I think Kinnaman was one of the ones that led in that, the digital Babylon stuff that talks about, and we've talked about this before, millennials and Gen Z taking in 20 hours on average of media per week that typically consumed by streaming or listening to podcasts or other things, and only one of those hours being anything with Christian content. You know, so we're talking about Christian millennials and Gen Z. When we think about that reality and out of that, you know, I think Barna asked the question, who's discipling the next generation? Yeah. Well, they're being discipled by influences of the world. The same thing in the church. If we're only here on Sunday morning and then we go outside for all of us, the rest of us, and never engage with, I don't see you through the week, I don't talk to you through the week, we just live the life and then we come back here. If we're not engaging as the family of God and being involved in each other's lives on a brother, sister, mother, father kind of wavelength in a sense, if that is not our mode of operation, if that is not the way our hearts are connected, our lives are connected, then it should come as no surprise to us that people are more influenced by the culture than they are by the church. Because again, when we've allowed ourselves to believe that church is what happens on Sunday morning, we've fooled ourselves. Church is who we are, not what we come to do and participate in. Or that's
I really love that, Paul, and that just thinking about that, I see how that connects in my life of the church as being the family of God. So some of y'all listening may know my story is that when I was 15, my mom died, and it always makes Mother's Day an interesting day for me. And I think of, in the midst of that, as we're talking about the family of God, and these people being mothers, fathers in that family, and I think of so many women at Grace Chapel who have been that for me, who've been mothers in the faith to me, who've been, and then men who've been fathers, brothers, sisters of what the family of God has meant in my life. I could go through a list of several women who have stepped in, and in a sense, they wouldn't call themselves in that role. We don't label it in that way, but would be mothers in my faith who have stepped in to fill that role and has fortified my faith in living under pressure. As someone who, through my high school years, did not have a female influence in my life in the home, and just think of so many people who've done that for me. And it is really powerful how the church is the family of God, how it shows up in that way. And I can equally speak to many men who've been fathers in my faith. I'm thankful to have a father at home who is a great influence, but just so many others, but just specifically in that area where on Mother's Day can often feel it's just an interesting day. But that's a really beautiful thing when the family of God is stepping up to be that.
Yeah, I'm thankful that you shared that, Ben, because it makes it very real and practical. And I think, there are some who may be almost exactly in your shoes. There are others who, for some reason, are ostracized from their family, but they found a new family here. And that was the case for most of the Christians in Thessalonica, by the way, is that unless their family came with them, unless their friends came with them, they were losing their family and friends, because for one to follow Christ, but the others to say no to following Christ meant alienation. So whether their mom or dad was around or not, if their mom or dad said, no, I'm not following Jesus with you, you may actually no longer be part of the family, whether you're coming from a Jewish background or a Gentile pagan background. Either way, they needed a whole new family, and that is what the Apostle Paul said they were getting. And that's why Paul chose to love them with the love of a mother, chose to encourage them and call them to what was best for them with the love of a father.
Love that. That's awesome. So as we come to a close on this conversation, Paul, what would you say? What's our practice out of this week?
Yeah, I think, spiritually, especially for those of us who are a little further along in the game at times, but no matter where we find ourselves, and we've sometimes talked about this in the sense of, I think we just did it several weeks ago, the concept of, if you're a Timothy, having a Paul, if you're a Paul, having a Timothy, if you're a Paul, having a Barnabas, and somewhere in the middle, and everybody needing someone in that. If we put that in family language, what we're saying is, if you're further along in the faith than someone else, you need to be a spiritual mother to someone. You need to be a spiritual father to someone. That's what it looks like to lean into being family. I think that's one thing. If you don't have family that's following Jesus, you need a spiritual family. So you need that. So seek out someone who'd be willing to be a spiritual parent to you in that sense. I think that's one very kind of practical step, is to think about that, to reflect on that and say, man, who do I see that needs maybe a spiritual parent? And maybe it's just somebody they're living here just north of Atlanta, and their mom and dad live in Texas or whatever, or in the Northeast. And man, the church needs to be a family, especially when people don't have Christian biological family around. They need, family, the blood of Jesus family to surround them, especially in these times of hardship. It also means as a family, we look around and we see what needs do people have, because that's what family does. If we were struggling financially, my parents, it's not like they have all the money in the world, but my parents would likely say, hey, how can we help you? Lori's parents would say the same. How can we help you get through these tough times? That's what family does, whether it be emotionally, financially, whether somebody is facing some other sort of pressure or hardship. We look to support each other as family. So be on the lookout for that kind of stuff. Look to see, can I be a spiritual parent to someone? Look to see, can I seek out a spiritual parent if that's what I need? And then, I would also say this. We didn't see some of the tough times that were coming, that were right around the corner in 2020. At the beginning of 2020, I don't think many of us would have predicted what we ended up living through. I think having experienced that and still being in this place where we're experiencing some of the anxiety and we feel like something's coming next, I kind of feel like something's coming next. I think I definitely have been in that place myself where I feel like the struggles are only going to mount for us for those of us who are trying to faithfully live out what we believe God is calling us to as we read the words of Scripture, believing they're inspired by the Holy Spirit, right? Yeah. So it's only going to get more difficult for us. The pressure is only going to increase. If you're someone that leans into the fight or flight approach naturally, would you do some heavy soul searching this week to see what you could do to maybe lean into the tend and befriend approach as your go-to when you're under pressure or when you see someone else under pressure? Could we lean into, as Christ followers, that tend and befriend approach? And it may just mean that, hey, this week you're going to have something happen and you're going to want to go to fight or flight really quickly. Take a deep breath, step back, and think about what would it look like instead of fight or flight, if I embrace fight or flight, to actually embrace tend or befriend in this situation and see what happens. Because I can tell you this, it is my guess that God is going to work through the tend and befriend approach a whole lot more than he's going to work through the fight or flight approach. So I think those would be just some practical steps if we were
really
looking to live more faithfully.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you, Paul. Thank you for sharing that with us. It's been a really good conversation, and certainly appreciate your work on this.
Pleasure.
So, as always, we hope you all have enjoyed this, and we hope this can be helpful in your journey in following Jesus, to practice being faithful to Jesus through this.
Absolutely.
We invite you to join us again next week. Next week, we'll have a special episode. It's our Milestone Sunday at Grace Chapel, so it's a week that we're going to be celebrating our seniors and our babies and just these milestones in students' lives. And I think we're going to have a guest on our podcast next week, so that's going to be an exciting episode. So we definitely encourage you to join us for that, and we look forward to hearing from you all again next week.
Yeah, we'll see you then.